Good afternoon. I'm Tom Segru, the director of the Penn Social Science and Policy Forum. Welcome to our afternoon workshop, and I want to say something about the raison d'etre of this workshop, which is we have two postdoctoral fellows this year, and as part of the postdoctoral fellowship program, we're providing the fellows with really an important and interesting opportunity to have their work in progress examined and discussed and really explored by major scholars in the field. And so one of our current postdoctoral fellows, James Walsh, will be presenting his manuscript in progress today, giving us an overview with commentaries from two distinguished commentators. But before we launch into that, I'm going to introduce everyone. And first, James Walsh, who's been around all year, and many of you have met him. He received his PhD in sociology from the University of California, Santa Barbara in 2011. And his research focuses on the relationship between globalization, immigration, and the nation state. And he's also working on other projects related involving temporary migration in Canada and Australia, social movements concerning border surveillance and policing, and the privatization of immigrant control through government partnerships and alignments with firms, local and municipal authorities, and citizens themselves. He's published already in a number of important journals, including Ethnic and Racial Studies, Sociological Forum, Citizenship Studies, and the Journal of Historical Sociology. He's currently working on a book-length project that grows out of his dissertation called Governing the Divide: Political Institutions and Immigration Control in the United States, Canada, and Australia, which is going to be the subject of this afternoon's workshop. Our two commentators are both distinguished and also interdisciplinary social scientists. One is Roger Smith, and Roger doesn't need much of an introduction to all of you here. He's a Christopher Brown Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Penn. He centers his research around constitutional law, American political thought, and modern legal and political theory. And his work hinges around an exploration of questions of citizenship, race, ethnicity, and gender. Rogers is author of a mind-boggling number of articles, including some that are many that are classics in the field. And he's also perhaps best known for his book, Civic Ideals, Conflicting Visions of Citizenship in U.S. History, which swept a number of awards and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and a number of other books, two of which are particularly relevant, I think, to this afternoon's discussion: Stories of Peoplehood, The Politics and Morals of Political Memberships, and earlier, Citizenship Without Consent, The Illegal Alien in the American Polity, which he co-authored with Peter Shaw. To James's left is Irene Bloemraad. Many of you heard her speak yesterday on her scholarship. She's Associate Professor of Sociology and the Thomas Garden Barnes Chair of Canadian Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. A political sociologist who explores questions of immigration, citizenship, and belonging. She, like Rogers and like James, are interdisciplinary scholars whose work really cuts across a number of conventional disciplinary boundaries. In fact, boundary crossing is certainly one of the themes that's going to run through our presentation this afternoon, and it's appropriate, actually, that all of us sitting up here in one way or another are involved in different kinds of boundary crossings, including disciplinary ones. Her work engages, among other things, and this is not an all-inclusive list, legal theory, ethnography, and policy analysis, including sociology and survey research. She's author of Becoming a Citizen: Incorporating Immigrants and Refugees in the United States and Canada. And she's editor of two other books. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn the floor to James, who's going to give us all an overview of his scholarship, and then to Rogers and Irene to comment.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. So today, with my discussion, I'm going to be providing a broad overview of my research on immigration policy or immigration control in the cases of the United States, Canada, and Australia. And so with this particular project, I was particularly interested in trying to explain important differences between what are otherwise a relatively similar set of cases. And so as we'll see with the subsequent discussion, the critical kind of defining differences between these cases has to do with the extent to which migration policy has been approached as an important tool in what we might consider the political economy of nation building. And so here, we'll see that while Canada and Australia have historically approached migration as what we might think of as a central plank of their overall strategies of national development, we see that policies in the U.S. on average have tended to be more reactive, ad hoc, and what we might consider economically unfocused. And so now before proceeding to the specifics of my study itself, I just want to provide a couple quick qualifications. And so first, given time constraints, my discussion today is by no means intended to provide an exhaustive overview of my research and its findings, and instead really what I'm trying to do today is just provide a general or overall view of what we might think of as the central tendencies in each of the case's regulatory approaches. And so in these respects, several important details and nuances have necessarily been excluded. However, I hope some of these will emerge in the subsequent discussion in Q&A. And now second, to be clear, when I say that I'm studying migration policy, I'm largely interested in issues concerning the admission and exclusion of migrants, as well as when relevant, policies concerning undocumented migration. And so in these regards, issues concerning refugees and humanitarian migration in particular, are excluded from my analysis. And so now in terms of how I'll be proceeding, there's three issues that I'd like to cover in the remaining time that I have. And so first would be detailing issues concerning case selection and significance, or otherwise why focus on these three particular countries. Second would be detailing the crucial differences that we find between the cases. And so here, I'll be providing some brief historical detail concerning both the evolution and defining contours of immigration policy. And now finally, would be discussing my explanation of why these otherwise similar cases have pursued distinctive regulatory approaches. And specifically here, I'll be highlighting the importance of variations in the institutional or political environment in which policy decisions are formulated and implemented. And so first, just in terms of case selection and significance. And so first, just in terms of kind of the general significance of immigration policy itself. And so I think migration policy is often overlooked. I'd argue that ultimately few policy domains are as profound and far-reaching in their social and political consequences as those concerning migration. And this is because specifically, we see that through the selection, exclusion, and regulation of migration, states exercise territorial sovereignty. They also shape the character of the population, and in doing so, they promote specific visions of social order and collective identity. And in studying these broader issues, I focused on the countries of the U.S., Canada, and Australia, which I'd argue for both substantive and methodological reasons, in many respects provide ideal cases for analysis. And so first, substantively, we see for the countries that since the late 19th century, all three have existed as sort of central hubs in the broader global migration system. And presently, we see that together the three countries receive approximately a quarter of the world's legal migrants, and at times over the last half century, this has been as high as 50%. And now, moreover, given their histories as settler colonies or societies, we see that all three cases really owe their existence to patterns of mass migration and settlement. And historically, migration has provided a critical force of demographic growth, economic development and expansion, and finally, internal colonization. And now second, so methodologically, we also see that the three countries present ideal settings for analyzing and explaining the nature and outcomes of immigration control. And so here, the idea would be that since the cases share so many theoretically relevant traits, so whether we're talking about extensive histories of mass migration or their status as advanced capitalist democracies and so on, comparisons between them are not only feasible, but they're also methodologically rigorous. And so the idea here is that they ultimately allow the researcher to control for the influence of other potential factors and really hone in and identify causally relevant differences. And so now, to spend a little bit of time detailing the critical differences between the cases. And here I'm going to be spending a little bit more time outlining policy in Canada and Australia, as I assume most people have sort of a basic familiarity with the history of immigration policy in the U.S. And so here, we ultimately see that despite, sort of their broad similarities, the countries have displayed important variations in policy approach and outcome. And most significantly would be that Canada and Australia, have tended to approach migration policy as a state-directed developmental initiative that historically has been thoroughly integrated with the country's planning of the economy and regulation of society. And so just to provide a few examples of how this has been the case. And so, for both countries, we see that almost as soon as they gain independence, immigration is promoted as a core component in broader strategies of nation building. And so, specifically, we find that through a series of central directives as well as extensive bureaucratic coordination, state officials in both countries seek to align migration policy, or specifically seek to align migration's volume and character with the exigencies of statecraft and nation building. So whether we're talking about demographic maintenance, industrial development and expansion, or labor market planning. And so in the case of Canada, we see that within a decade after gaining independence, in 1867, Prime Minister John Macdonald at the time comes to implement what is known as the national policy. And so this is, essentially we can think of it as a blueprint of national development. And so it's based on principles of economic nationalism. It rests on three central dimensions or components. First is the implementation of high tariff walls on manufactured goods. Second are commitments to settling the Western Prairie provinces. And third would be commitments to expansive mass migration. And of these three components, migration is ultimately viewed as really critical to the policy's success, as migrants are intended to provide the necessary settlers, workers, and consumers to help bring about the creation of a balanced, integrated, and protected national economy. And so to these ends, the government invests significant resources in trying to proactively pull or draw migrants to the country's shores. And so Canada launches an army of immigration agents to Europe to advertise opportunities within the country. And it also offers subsidized fares, settlement assistance, free land, and a series of low-cost loans and other inducements. And so now this approach largely continues up until the onset of the Great Depression, and in proportional terms, especially since the start of the 20th century, it displays considerable success. And in particular, between 1910 and 1914 alone, immigration winds up adding a fifth to the country's total population. And unlike the United States, we see that migration rates remain expansive following the conclusion of World War I. And now similar trends can also be witnessed in Australia. And in Australia, largely reflecting the power of the working class. So when Australia gains independence in 1901, it displays some of the highest rates of union density in the world, as well as some of the highest living standards and wage rates. And so when the country gains independence, the first piece of legislation that is passed by Parliament is what's known as the Immigration Restriction Act, or what comes to be popularly referred to as the White Australia policy. And so this piece of legislation effectively excludes all non-European migrants, and additionally, it gives the government significant discretion in admitting and excluding other migrants. And so as the policy evolves over time, specifically over the next decade, it becomes apparent that more than simply a restrictive piece of legislation, White Australia is also devoted to attracting significant numbers of white and specifically British migrants. And the government, like Canada, and it actually goes even further in devoting significant resources to promoting migration. And so as a result, we see that about 2/3 of migrants that arrived before World War II received some degree of government assistance. And so together, these sorts of arrangements are central to what's been referred to as the Australian settlement, which essentially encompasses a set of foundational regulations that are intended to secure the country's independence and well-being. And so alongside tariffs and commitments to mass migration, so very similar to Canada in these regards, it also includes commitments to industrial arbitration, social provision, extensive safety nets, and restrictions on the entry of non-European workers. And all of these dimensions together are intended to bring about the creation of an integrated, autonomous, and protected national market and society. And now in the immediate post-war period for both countries, we see that these sorts of strategies largely continue. And migration remains a critical developmental initiative that through extensive planning and bureaucratic coordination is intended to complement broader Keynesian strategies of economic growth and development. And so for both countries, migration, again, is viewed as critical in fueling industrial growth and expanding the workforce, as well as providing a stable base of consumers. And this really, sets the two countries apart from policies in Europe and in the U.S. at the time, where there's more, there's commitments to sort of a guest worker model of migration, where migration is largely approached as bringing in additional workers, but not affecting, levels of aggregate demand and so on. And so unlike the U.S., where we find legal migration dropping to historically low levels during the period, both countries, again, actively promote and organize migration, and migrants during the period provide approximately half of population growth, and in relation to the workforce, expand it by approximately 2/3. And this is a bit more pronounced in Australia when compared to Canada. And so now moving into the present, we find that the most recent iteration of policy emerges with the onset of post-industrialism and globalization beginning in the 1970s and 80s. And now while these features kind of emerge in a gradual or incremental fashion, by the 1990s, both countries' policies are ultimately intended to kind of complement and advance broader political economic change. And specifically, their policies are intended to promote flexibility, efficiency, and competitiveness within global markets. And so to provide a few examples of how this has been the case, and perhaps most significantly, we see that both countries have come to promote what are known as point systems for selecting skilled and self-supporting migrants. And so the point systems essentially grade, rank, and select migrants on the basis of human capital and other criteria that are assumed to be predictive of economic contributions and successful integration. So whether we're talking about things like skills, age, education, work experience, and linguistic ability, and so on. And so presently, in both countries, around 70% of legal migrants are admitted through the point systems. And now additionally, both countries, but this is especially true in the case of Canada, have pursued what are known as business migration programs that are intended to attract and settle wealthy investors, entrepreneurs, and executives, and thereby facilitate economic growth and regional integration. And specifically, they're intended to kind of establish inroads within strategic emerging markets within the broader Asian Pacific region. And now finally, both countries also come to implement regional migration schemes that allow the states and provinces to play an active role in promoting and organizing migration. And both have also recently adopted, and this is especially true since the mid-1990s, both countries have pursued extensive programs of temporary migration that, unlike the U.S., provide relatively easier access to permanent residence and citizenship. And so now to turn to the U.S. And so in contrast to Canada and Australia, we see the policies in the U.S. have tended to be more schizophrenic, inchoate, and frequently defined by what we might think of as contradictory goals and mandates. And these differences have not only persisted, but in many respects have grown more apparent over time. And so to provide a few examples of this, so first I want to just start with some sort of quantitative indicators that outline these differences, and then I'll proceed to sort of some, by discussing sort of the qualitative features of policy itself. And so, to provide some evidence, we see that first, in proportional terms, rates of migration are lower in the United States than they are in Canada and Australia, and this has been especially true since the 1950s. And additionally, we see that rates of migration in the U.S. have tended to not be adjusted in accordance with broader economic conditions. And so in Canada and Australia, we see that immigration rates historically have been adjusted in line with the upswings and the downswings of the business cycle. However, in the U.S., we see that between 1950 and 1990 specifically, immigration and unemployment are actually positively correlated. Meaning that immigration has tended to be low during periods of low unemployment and economic expansion, and has tended to be high during recessionary periods. And now finally, we see that since the 1960s, the proportion of immigrants that are admitted on the basis of economic or occupational grounds is significantly lower than in Canada and Australia. And so, as I'd mentioned, approximately 70% of legal migrants are admitted through the point systems in Canada and Australia. In the case of the US, migrants that are admitted for economic purposes, it's around 15% of legal migrants. And so now, in terms of kind of qualitative differences. In the US, here we see that major policy episodes have tended to be defined by either first, policies that are based on what we might think of as grand bargains or historic compromises that seek to fuse and reconcile conflicting interests and demands. And second would be the pursuit of what we might think of as symbolic measures that are defined by significant exemptions and patterns of ineffectual or non-enforcement. And so in the first instance, so in terms of grand bargains or compromises, we see that nearly every major piece of legislation passed within the U.S. context has tended to rest on a mix of expansive and restrictive features. And so while there are several potential examples to touch on here, I'll just mention briefly probably two of the most famous pieces of legislation in America's immigration history, which would be the 1924 Quota Act and then the 1965 Hart-Celler Act. And so first, the Quota Act that's passed in 1924, while its sort of stated intent is to reduce rates of new migration from Southern and Eastern Europe, we see that when the legislation is passed, it also comes to include exemptions for migrants from within the Western Hemisphere. And this is intended to ensure that many industries, but specifically southwestern agriculture, retain access to a low-wage workforce. And now additionally, the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, which is widely considered to be an unambiguously liberal and expansive piece of legislation. It certainly kind of equalizes the quota system so that both Asian countries as well as those within Southern and Eastern Europe obtain parity with Northern and Western European countries. We see that the legislation also introduces quotas on previously exempted countries within the Western Hemisphere, which really, I think if we want to understand why we've seen a significant increase in undocumented migration since the 1970s, this is one of the primary reasons. Now, moreover, in the U.S., we also routinely find the pursuit of laws and policies that tend to be symbolic in nature and are defined by patterns of weak or non-enforcement. And so some prominent examples of this. And so I think two examples to touch on would first be efforts to try and regulate the workforce and impose employer sanctions. This is an effort to try and regulate and control undocumented migration. But we also see these features as well in terms of policies concerning border control and enforcement. And so in terms of employer sanctions, and so we can really see going back to the 1950s, there have been extensive efforts to try and reduce unauthorized or undocumented migration in these regards. And the first instance that I'll mention is the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act. And so this piece of legislation, it contains several features, but one of the prominent features are efforts to try and address growing rates of undocumented migration following the implementation of the Bracero program by making it illegal to harbor unauthorized residents. And harboring initially is largely conceived in terms of employment. However, as the legislation passes through Congress, it comes to contain an important loophole known as the Texas Proviso. And specifically, this component of the legislation says that employment itself is excluded from definitions of harboring undocumented migration, which ultimately sort of undermines the legislation's original intent. And now moving forward in history to the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, we find that the components of the legislation that concern the implementation of employer sanctions ultimately wind up being weakly enforced and written in a way that ensures that the risk of prosecution is negligible for employers. And now finally, we see that gaps between formal policy goals and their practical outcomes are also witnessed in relationship to border control and enforcement. And so at the risk of some oversimplification, here we see the existence of formal policies and enforcement efforts that are designed to seal the border and prevent unauthorized entries, but in practice have done little to prevent undocumented entries and instead have functioned to provide continuous access to a distinctly low-wage, tractable, and expendable workforce. And so as a result, we see that in the contemporary period, much of the quote-unquote economic benefits of migration have been realized ultimately through the malintegration of formal policy goals and outcomes. And current policies in many respects reflect what Ari Zolberg has referred to as the maintenance of a backdoor system of labor supply. And so now, to conclude, I just want to end by discussing my explanation of why we see these important variations. And so of particular importance here is identifying the specific factors that explain why Canada and Australia, on the one hand, have been able to pursue largely technocratic approaches to managing migration, while regulatory efforts in the United States have been much more disjointed and incoherent. And ultimately, I argue that cross-case differences can be explained in relationship to the institutional setup of states themselves. And in particular, we see that the cases display important variations in, first, the internal structure of the state apparatus, and second would be the configuration of state-society boundaries. And so in the first instance, we see that states can vary in the degree to which power is unified or concentrated within the hands of the executive versus instances in which authority is fragmented and diffused or divided between the various branches or sectors of government. And now second, in terms of the boundaries between government and society. And so here we see that state-society boundaries can be configured in a way that are either insulated or permeable. And so in the former instance, political officials and state functionaries are shielded from the influence of powerful societal actors, while in the latter, organized interests display significant capacities of access, appeal, and influence, and in turn display greater leverage in influencing the actual contours of state action. And so, ultimately in instances where states are unified and insulated, policymaking emerges as a bureaucratic prerogative in which state authorities display significant discretion and autonomy in formulating and implementing immigration policy. And now conversely, when states are fragmented and permeable, policies tend to be more incoherent as the number of participants and contestants is multiplied significantly. And so ultimately, the existence of what we might think of as multiple competing power centers often functions to pull policy in conflicting and often contradictory directions. And so now, to turn to how these differences actually manifest themselves within the cases. And so for Canada and Australia, we see that both countries display, for the most part, unified and insulated states. And so reflecting their British histories, both display parliamentary models of government that are based on the fusion of legislative and executive power. And ultimately, under these arrangements, the Prime Minister, by definition, is drawn from the majority party within Parliament. And now additionally, for both countries, we see that the formulation of migration policy largely occurs within the state bureaucracy as opposed to the legislature. Dynamics that ensure that groups possessing opposing interests, whether those would be rival political camps or peak interest groups, are unable to directly challenge political decisions once the majority group has reached consensus on a course of action. And so these arrangements have ensured that in general terms, immigration policymaking has been a matter of administration as opposed to a matter of politics. And so given the absence of internal divisions within the state, as well as the lack of direct access on the part of organized interests, state officials have largely been empowered to act in what we might think of as a unilateral and singular fashion. And now this has been so much the case that major decisions concerning migration, whether decisions concerning annual intakes, the nature of selection, the balance of intake categories, and so on, are determined by the immigration bureaucracy or Prime Minister's cabinet and are carried out in the absence of parliamentary influence or oversight. And now in the case of the United States, we see that in contrast to Canada and Australia, the American state, as I'm sure most of you are aware, is internally fragmented and displays state-society boundaries that are highly permeable. And so on the one hand, reflecting the country's revolutionary origins and in general kind of anti-statist political culture, the American state is organized around a model of divided authority that provides checks against the emergence of a strong activist state and the concentration of power within a single government agency or institution. And so here, we see that significant divisions between the executive and Congress, as well as divisions within Congress itself, have created what are referred to as multiple veto points that enable even a handful of contestants to stall or obstruct reforms. And these dynamics have ultimately inhibited the emergence of decisive and sweeping reforms. And now additionally, given that Congress is opposed to the immigration bureaucracy as the central decision-making body, policymaking on average tends to be defined by significant pressure from actors outside of the formal political system. And so here, we find that powerful organized interests, whether they be unions, employers, ethnic advocacy groups, and so on, have historically frequently played a direct role in shaping the contours of political action. So either by directly participating in formal hearings, actively writing portions of legislation, or routinely consulting with members of Congress and their staff. And so the consequence of these sorts of arrangements can ultimately be witnessed on three levels. And so first, given the necessity of satisfying multiple competing parties, the country's institutional environment has created a decision-making system that's overdetermined, highly unpredictable, and ultimately defined by significant patterns of negotiation and compromise. And so, again, if we look back at several major pieces of legislation within the country's history, so again, whether the 1924 Quota Act or the 1965 Act, among others, we find that frequently, it's been a handful of powerful constituents that have succeeded in exacting crucial reforms and affecting policy outcomes. And this has often occurred in ways that significantly transform the original intent of policy and introduce unintended consequences. And now second, these sorts of arrangements have also facilitated the emergence of what I previously referred to as symbolic laws and policies. And so laws like those concerning employer sanctions, for example, which essentially claim to do one thing but in practice achieve something quite different, at least in the short term, help resolve conflicting interests and demands. And specifically, they help communicate the government's resolve and authority in addressing certain, addressing certain issues and problems without actively altering or transforming those conditions on the ground. And now third and finally, would be that the obstructionist nature of institutional arrangements has established protracted patterns of gridlock, stalemate, and inertia, and has made it extremely difficult to reform or overhaul entrenched approaches. And so in the contemporary context, this is witnessed most clearly in the repeated failure of efforts at comprehensive immigration reform. And so just to, as a final concluding statement to kind of bring these issues up into the present. And so in the U.S., we see that the current Senate bill, S-744, if passed, would ultimately mark a fundamental shift in the nature of immigration policy. And so this would, at least the economic dimensions of the proposed legislation would first create a point system like Canada and Australia, and also make migration policy much more economically focused. However, at this stage, I'd argue that it remains, probably too early to predict how these dynamics will actually play out. And I think if history provides any indication, it's entirely probable that what's currently on the table, if it's even passed, may very well be modified out of recognition. And with that, I'll go ahead and stop there. So thank you.
Thank you, James. And I forgot to come up with who wants to go first. Rogers, want to go first?
Flip a coin.
Happy to. Do you have a preference?
Go for it.
Well, one of the challenges of aging is that you have to calculate what font size works for you, and I miscalculated this morning, so this means I either must stand up or wear my unflattering reading glasses, and I decided to do the latter. So, James' work, in the parts that I've seen, makes two main contributions. One is a kind of historical institutionalist move of bringing the state back into immigration policy, emphasizing the importance of configuration of state structures in their relation to social interests. And secondly, it brings more extensive and explicit comparative analysis to immigration policy with his three cases. I think both these moves are valuable, and the second especially goes beyond the existing literature. On the first claim, the focus on state structures and their relations to society, I am sympathetic to the motivating claim that scholars for too long stressed purely societal factors, economic and cultural, in trying to explain immigration without sufficient attention to the political institutions and policy-making processes that actually generate immigration policies. And I'm also sympathetic to the broad argument that the more fragmented and permeable nature of the U.S. state, arising both from its national separation of powers and federalism, make a coherent, centralized immigration policy more difficult for the United States, and especially so today. I have three concerns about the argument as I read it. The first is that while I'm sympathetic to the claim for the importance of state structures, you have to be careful, I think, not to overstate it. The reality is that the broad immigration policies in the three countries have actually been broadly similar, as you acknowledged, through most of their histories, diverging the most recently. And those policies have generally been to seek to get the labor that the country wishes. The U.S. has done so less aggressively, but it has had to do so less aggressively in order to get immigrant labor through much of its history. It also has this distinctive feature in the 20th century. We've gotten a lot of agricultural labor and some service economy labor through the back door, and that's a non-trivial difference related to the factors James emphasizes. But still, the pattern has been to meet labor needs, along with more that I'll get to. And the most striking diversion, apart from the back door that generates the undocumented population, has come recently when Canada and Australia have moved to privileging the nation's perceived economic needs over the concerns of particular employers and concerns for family reunification. In the U.S., family reunification is still officially the #1 criterion for immigrants to enter, and probably in reality, particular employer interests are #1 in shaping American policies. And the point is, the state structures have been had the differences that they've had through much of their history, but the policies have diverged more recently. And while James documents some executive centralization of immigration policy in Canada and Australia recently, there haven't been dramatic transformations in the state structure, so the explanation of the recent greater policy divergence can't simply be state structure, nor is it simply state structure when you go through the case studies. They show it's only part of the story. Some of the rhetoric tends to suggest it's going to have more explanatory power than I think it does. And I also think it's a minor flaw, an understandable one, but the literature review is a bit overstated, putting scholars in either a purely pluralist or purely unchanging culturalist or Marxist explanatory camps, in contrast to an account indicating state structure. A lot of the recent literature is more sophisticated, I think, and on behalf of my own discipline, I'd say that Dan Titchener and Aries Ohlberg's books in the 2000s, both of which you rely on extensively, discuss all the factors that are in your account, and so it's not quite so novel to emphasize the state structures. But nonetheless, bringing them in more explicitly, especially in a comparative perspective, valuable thing to do. My second concern is that arises from the striking fact that in all three countries, even as, due to labor market needs, they were often actively welcoming Northern European immigrants in the 19th and 20th century, nonetheless, they all came to adopt race-based limits on immigration, including immigrant labor. They're recruiting lots of Northern European labor. They're keeping out labor from other parts of the country in ways that overrode particular employer interests. Some of the employers wanted the Chinese labor to continue, others. And this fact leads James to say several times, he presented the project today, Political Economy of Nation Building, emphasis on state structures. But the chapters say several times that in the 19th, early 20th centuries, race was more important than economic factors in determining immigration policies. I think that's right, but the shortcoming here is that the chapters don't really give an account of why. There's no real theorizing race in the role of nation building, and I think that the project would benefit from more explicit engagement with not just the political economy of nation building, but the larger literature on nation building in its intertwined relationship with state building, and particularly the role of race in nation building. In my view, the U.S. elaborated racial stories of national identity originally for economic reasons, in large part to justify displacement of the indigenous tribes and to justify African American slavery. But I think that many Americans then became so invested in a vision of America as a white man's nation that they would cling to that vision even at times when it was not economically beneficial to the nation as a whole to do so. And this is a theme that isn't really developed in the chapters. And in fact, James frequently refers to American immigration policies through most of the 19th century as simply expressing a liberal, free labor, laissez-faire ideology. I don't think that account is adequate because America was legally a slave labor country until 1865, and it then adopted a ban on Chinese labor, limiting movement rights of labor in 1882, and so the reign of free labor ideas was limited, to say the least. Lots of desires for European labor, not a desire for free labor from other sources. Now, I can't make the comparison on all the sources of white Australia policies or Canada's adoption of race-based immigration systems, which they did, and in emulation to some degree of America's. But that comparison is something I'd hope to learn more about through this comparative study, and it's not as fully developed in these chapters. I invite James to say more now, but also address it more fully as the book is completed. One reason I think it's worth emphasizing more is because I actually think it contributes to the argument about configurations of state structures and state-society relations. I think if we learn more about the role of race in both nation and state building in these societies, we might understand more fully why America has had the patterns it's had in contrast to the others, including America's current clinging to family reunification and not an economic value point system to a greater degree than Canada or Australia. Although, again, even here the contrast it can be overstated, since, as James noted, the Senate is pushing a move toward a more Canadian-Australian system. Whether we'll get that is very much in doubt. But the point I want to make now is that America's fragmented state structure arose in part because slavery was regionally concentrated, even though national laws and courts supported it. And that fact meant that the constitutional system was designed, it contributed to the fact that the constitutional system was designed reserving rights for states, robust federalism, and the national government had state representation in the Senate and in the Electoral College, along with popular representation. And these features contributed to the fragmented structure of the U.S. Political systems, and of course the divisions between the regions led to civil war, the ending of slavery, but then thereafter the former slave states became the home of the Jim Crow segregation system, and this fact shaped the 1965 Immigration Act. and the priority it gave to family reunification. You get in if you're a relative of a U.S. citizen before the economic skills categories for coming in. Most of you are probably familiar, but most immigrants who come in legal come in first under family reunification, second under economically valuable skills. There are also asylums and refugees. There's some other categories, but the quotas fill up on these first two categories. Family reunification and skills are most of the legal immigration. Family reunification distinctively first in the U.S., differentiating it from Canada and Australia today. How did we give this priority to family reunification? Well, it was in part because the Southern white supremacists, like Sam Ervin of North Carolina, that senator who originally opposed the '65 Immigration Act, went along with it in the end because he was persuaded that family reunification would preserve the predominantly Northern European caste of the American citizenry. He thought most Americans are Northern European descended, and so most relatives will be Northern Europeans. This was wildly wrong. But even the proponents of the act thought that that is what would occur. It proved, of course, to do just the opposite, letting in primarily Latino immigrants, contributing over time to Asian nations' immigration. They thought they were cutting this off in part by the Western quotas. That was, yeah, there is some risk family reunification will encourage Latinos, so they accompanied with ceilings in the Western Hemisphere for the first time, which did contribute to the growth of undocumented population, as James indicated. The point is that this was family reunification was enacted in part out of the concerns about the racial transformation of the U.S. Nonetheless, major transformations were occurring in this period. The major victories of the civil rights movement against the notion of America as a white nation, and that contributed to our current political environment, I suggest, in at least the following way. We have come to embrace a national story in which we made heroic struggles in overcoming our racist past, and we have proliferated a set of civil rights as well as immigrant advocacy groups that I think gain political clout and prestige in part because they are understood to be part of that noble struggle and transformation, even when we're deeply ambivalent about the consequences of the transformation of the '65 Immigration Act. We're not willing to say, look, that old white supremacist America, that was really good, even if people may feel that deep down. And instead, precisely because family reunification has worked over time to undercut the predominance of white Americans over others, the civil rights and immigration advocacy groups champion the family reunification standard in contemporary immigrant debates, aided by those employer interests who are benefiting from immigrant labor. And these groups together are powerful enough, taking advantage of America's fragmented structure, to make it so far impossible to drop the priority of family reunification, which they have dropped in Canada and and Australia. And so I think if you include these struggles over racial identity, you help understand the structure of advocacy groups, and you both help understand why we have family reunification and why we have a politics in which there are groups that are championing family reunification. And my presumption is that because Canada and Australia didn't have a civil war over slavery, they didn't have comparable civil rights movement struggles of the same magnitude and visibility in regard to surviving forms of discrimination. They don't have such strong modern national narratives of noble transformation that can assist civil rights and immigrant advocacy groups. That would be my guess, but I don't really know because I don't know that much about these countries, and there's not a lot of attention to this dimension of politics in the chapters. So I would have liked to have heard more about that as well. But I want to underline that these points don't take away from the value of James' comparative analysis or his focus on state structures and their relation to social interests. They simply amount to saying, this is really interesting, can you tell me more?
Thank you, Roger.
All right. So I think there were overlaps in the way that Roger's read and thought about this, and I did as well. So to avoid too much duplication, I'm going to say he's right about race. Think about it more.
Okay. Absolutely.
So listen to him. So let me go through bits and parts of this, and I'm going to rely a lot on some of the manuscript, the actual words on the page. So Rogers and I got 4 chapters of the evolving manuscript. And some of it will echo some of Roger's first points, and then I'm going to add to it, and I'll try to put more on the Canada side. Now,
Okay.
Unfortunately, neither Rogers or I know enough about Australia, I think, to comment at all about that, but you'll want that kind of feedback too. The first thing that I would urge you to do, and you did it actually, I'd say better orally than maybe in some of the written form, is to tell us exactly what you're going to explain. Because the key questions you have on page 2, and I'm going to read it out for those of you who didn't get to see the manuscript. How are we to explain why countries apply distinct policy regimes to address similar problems? What are the causal mechanisms that structure the timing, character, and direction of immigration control? How are the policies and practices related to those of other social domains, whether the economy, security, or welfare state, among others? Now, this is really broad. And reading through sort of the thick description that you have, I sort of felt like the thing you were trying to explain kept shifting a little bit. And I guess in a certain level, you just want to think about control of migration. And the way you articulated it to the room, I thought could be persuasive. But I kept getting lost about, are you trying to explain a particular policy? And in your discussion, you talk about 1924, you talk about 1965. Is it the actual policy that you want to explain? And I think that's important because as you write yourself, the story of broad policy change in these 3 countries are extremely similar. Like, I think for an outside observer, you could tell a story about 19th century, they want immigrants. At the turn of the 20th century, all of them decide they don't want non-white immigrants. All these things are put into place. There is a difference between the U.S. that basically shuts the door in the 20s and Canada and Australia don't. So that is a difference. The 1960s, all of them make changes and all of them open the door to immigrants from all over the world. There is a difference in the emphasis on economic versus family reunification, but largely the same. And then moving forward, how much difference is it compared to other kinds of countries, with the one big difference potentially being undocumented migration in the United States, which is just much larger and more expansive. And you make the argument, like Ari Zolberg, about it's a policy choice, and in a way it is, but also there's geography.
Yes.
And so it sort of feels like, well, if that's the big story, there's a lot of similarity. So I think I would urge you to sort of highlight what it is exactly you're trying to explain, because you talked about the particular policy, you talk about the numbers, you talk about the composition of the immigrants. You also talked about the degree to which policies and immigration link up in sort of a coherent whole with other policies. So is it sort of this economic planning, people as part of labor, which is part of economic development, which is part of nation building? So that's more a vision, I guess. You talk about the non-policy in terms of undocumented migration. And then you sort of put this all under the heading of control of migration. But I would urge you to be a little bit more specific about what pieces are you trying to explain, or how do you understand what you're trying to explain. And just as a matter of writing a manuscript, I would highly encourage you to have a table or some kind of timeline where you put in the 3 countries the major policy moments, the major things that you want to explain. So is it the fact that the U.S. shuts off in the 20s? Is it the fact that it's economic versus family in the 60s? You know, help us, and as a reader, especially because you're doing such an ambitious project where people are going to come into the project as maybe experts on Canada or the US or Australia, but very few are going to know all three cases, and so you're going to help people understand the three cases. And then thinking of this idea of control of migration, if that's sort of the way you're thinking of it, and sort of like how much is migration controlled and part of a broader vision, the contemporary period, I think people will say that Australia and Canada control more and the US less. But you could argue, and I think Ari Zolberg has, that historically, if you think of the 1920s, the fact that the U.S. was actually able to completely shut down immigration for large parts from 1924 up to like 65, that was control.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, you know, there was the Bracero program, and there was a little bit of illegal Chinese migration, paper sons and stuff, but, you know, you said the numbers yourself. It went down to less than 5% of the population was foreign-born compared to Canada and Australia. So that is a form of control. And so you want to think about, what do you mean by controlling migration? Rogers touched on this second thing that I want to talk about, which is how you situate your argument in the broader literature. And for those of you who weren't able to read, for those of you who weren't able to read the manuscript, James is putting this in sort of a broader political sociology perspective, where he says, when you think of something like immigration policy or understanding state policy, there's three basic approaches. One is a pluralist approach. There's interest groups that have different interests, and the state is basically a black box or a forum or an arena where those interest groups fight it out. The second is a culturalist idiom, and here drawing largely on maybe more European scholarship, especially Rogers Brubaker. So people have particular visions of nationhood and the nation in idioms, and that influences policy. And the third he calls Marxist. I wouldn't call it Marxist.
Okay.
You're going to sound very 70s.
Okay.
I would, I don't know, you could call it political economy,
Okay.
You could call it, there's a lot of different ways to call it. And I'm not sure the people that you cite would all appreciate being called Marxist either, so you want to be careful.
Fair enough, fair enough.
But the third approach would be a political economy approach, where the general thrust is states want to encourage capitalism. There are huge economic interests, and immigration is part of those economic interests. And so the state decisions and policy is a reflection of economic interests for cheap labor or particular types of labor in order to do accumulation, if you want to use more Marxist terms. And then you go in there and you say, well, my approach is different. It's this institutionalist, historical institutionalist. And I think very much like Rogers, I'm sympathetic to that overall mission. I like the way you're thinking about it as sort of more unitary states versus more fragmented states and more porous or isolated, insulated state-society relations. But I think you overstate quite a bit the degree to which people haven't thought about the state. So I would echo Rogers in saying, especially if you think of the case studies that people have done of U.S. or Canadian policy, I don't know about Australia enough, much of it, especially the recent stuff, is state-centered. I mean, I think Tickner and Zolberg are all about the state. So I think you need to recognize that. And I would say that probably any of the Canadian studies of Canadian immigration policy, some of it is more political economy and more focusing on the capitalist, but almost all of it talks about the state and ministerial orders and council and et cetera, et cetera. So to characterize the field in the sort of the society way you do as pluralist, cultural, or political economy Marxist, I think is overstating it. And I think you can still make a huge contribution by saying people have used an institutionalist perspective when understanding a country, a case, but they haven't used it sufficiently when doing the comparative analysis. And so that's what you're bringing to the table. But think about your language, because remember, there will be people reviewing you
Gotcha.
and reading this and recommending it to others.
And being offended.
Yes, yes, indeed. And then as you think about a conclusion, think about how you want to situate your institutionalist perspective as a broader contribution to immigration studies. Because when you talk about the pluralist versus political economy versus culturalist approach, most of the people you cite are people who have been focused on European politics or policy and or Europe in comparison to the Anglo-settler countries, right? So people are thinking from a European perspective. And so you want to be able to explain to them how your Canada, US, Australia comparison is going to help them understand France or Germany or the UK or Denmark or the Netherlands. So think very carefully about, are the things that you want to put on the table, this unitary, fragmented, and porous, insulated variables, or lenses through which to think about it. And one thing that struck me is, as you go through your comparison, you put it up as a comparison of 3 countries, but in the end, the way you talk about it is 2 countries, or 2 cases, right? It's the US versus Canada/Australia. And Canada and Australia are largely interchangeable for you. Be careful about that, because all the Canadians and Australians will be peeved. And it might, and you might be right. It might be that taking this comparative lens allows you to make those kind of comparisons. But what it raises is, if it's about unitary, fragmented, porous, and insulated, is it then just a story of American exceptionalism? So it's the US has a particular immigration policy and all other countries are different? Because all other countries that we think of in the industrialized West are parliamentary systems or some kind of similar parliamentary systems. I mean, think of almost all of continental Europe, you're talking parliamentary systems. So the way you've set it up now is it would be the US and then there'd be all the parliamentary systems. Alternatively, do you think you're going to have the US, Canada, Australia, and some other similar countries, maybe the UK parliamentary first past the post system, and then you're going to have a proportional representation parliamentary system or a non-federal system? So this is going beyond your cases, but in order to make the broader theoretical argument and to sort of be able to speak to a broader literature, you're going to have to think about, how do you go beyond those 2 cases and thinking about when institutions matter and how they matter? Let me look through some of my other notes. All right. So Rogers has already touched on the importance of race, and like I said, you really, I think you need to listen to that. Other things to consider, and I don't think any of the things I'm going to say undermine your argument, which I thought was sort of on the whole persuasive, and I agreed with your depiction, at least of the 2 cases that I know, Canada and the United States. But I think you underplay certain things, and I would urge you to think a little bit more about them. First of all, I think you underplay federalism. And I think you need more of a story of federalism. So all 3 cases are federal countries, so that helps you in your most similar design. But the evolution of federalism across them is different. So the US starts as a very decentralized system. Ari Zolberg has made the argument that immigration policy in the 19th century was largely states making their own passenger laws. And what's interesting is the Canadian case, Canada in the Constitution, the provinces actually have constitutionally protected rights over immigration with the federal government, but it's actually in the Canadian Constitution. And what's interesting is that the provinces never really acted on it originally, or not very much. And so the federal government, sort of dominated. But then as time goes on, at least in the United States, in part because of the Supreme Court and plenary power, the federal government starts dominating in the US case. So you go from the states to the federal government. And in the Canadian case, especially in the contemporary period, it's been the opposite direction. So it's been the federal going down to the provincial. And in fact, every single of the 10 Canadian provinces now has an immigration policy, and all 10 of the Canadian provinces now have settlement policies. And in fact, a few years ago, the majority of the economic migrants were now coming under provincial nominee programs.
Okay.
So there is this whole shift in sort of how this is happening. Now, I still don't think it necessarily undermines parts of your argument, because what's striking in the Canadian case is that all 10 provinces are on board with this very economic, we want migrants, we like migrants, they're engines of development kind of approach. So it's not that the approach is different, but it actually has made it a more fragmentary system, at least in the workings of how it is. And there's more intergovernmental negotiation. And in fact, I don't know the historical period as well as I probably should, but there was a lot of interprovincial and intergovernmental negotiation in the early part of the 20th century, especially over the Oriental question in British Columbia. So I think you need a little bit more of attention to federalism. And I have some very recent work that's coming out on this in the Canadian side that I can share with you.
Great.
Another thing that I think you want to emphasize more, and I think this actually bolsters your argument in a way, is the courts. You talk a lot about Congress and the presidency and sort of other actors in there, but I think that part of why the parliamentary system in Australia and Canada were able to be maybe more directed and unitary is because there was no constitutional review. There was the Canadian courts, the Supreme Court could not strike down legislation on sort of a Bill of Rights kind of grounds. It was allowed to adjudicate between intergovernmental disputes, so it could adjudicate on when British Columbia denied Asians the vote and the federal government was sort of hemming and hawing about whether they should do that or not. Like, the court was allowed to come into that, but it was not, no one of Asian origin could stand in front of the court and say, you're denying me my rights, which is very different than the United States, especially when you think of like the extension of birthright citizenship to Asians in the United States, right? So the courts had more of a role, and even if there was plenary power in the United States, the fact that the courts could not play a role in Canada, and I assume Australia, is, I think, a really important part of the story, and I think it speaks to also what might be a contemporary, more of a contemporary divergence, and I'm not sure about this, but your story historically is the US is like this, Canada, Australia are like this, and they're moving. And I think potentially the contemporary story since '82 in Canada's been moving a little bit more to the US model, or a little bit more fragmentary because of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So in 1982, for those of you who are not totally versed in Canadian politics, Canada gets a written constitution which has a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, very like the US Bill of Rights, and then at that point people can actually take their cases to the court, and the court can deem legislation from Parliament unconstitutional. And this is really important when you think of the Singh decision and a whole bunch of different court decisions, which has given much more standing to immigrants in Canada. And so I think the federal government is much more careful now, even when they start, like, except maybe the Harper government currently, but has been in the 80s and 90s, much more careful about what they can get away with because of the feeling of the Supreme Court, which I think makes it more American in a way. So I would urge you to think more about that. Another thing I think you should think a little bit more about, or at least put into the story more, is that when you talk about globalization, you talk about globalization as economic globalization, and the story of the international regime, at least in the chapters that we saw, is very much a story of international movement of people, money, goods, etc. And I think you underplay international relations in a foreign policy way. I think you underplay too much the politics of the international sphere. And 2 points that I would raise, even though I know humanitarian migrants aren't your primary concern, I'm not convinced you can just carve out your economic migrants from the humanitarian migrants so easily. I mean, I think there's been a lot of historical slippage between those categories, and you can't understand US refugee policy or even pre-1980 asylum policy without the Cold War. You know, every single person who came under parolee power in the United States prior to 1980 was largely a foreign policy, fleeing communist kind of person. And that has huge implications for immigration policy. And in the Canadian side, and I'm not sure about the Australian side, the international part of it was included things like the Commonwealth. And so, you know, Phil Tridaf, I can never pronounce his last name, Triadafilopoulos, you know, he has a great argument about how the Caribbean nations in the Commonwealth really pushed Canada to end some of its racist policies, and Canada wanting to be a leader in the Commonwealth, that was one of the things that pushed the bureaucrats in the 60s to get rid of that. So there are foreign policy considerations that go beyond just economics that I think you need to bring into it. And then this will be my last point. Just like Rogers was saying, that race is central to understanding the U.S. experience, and I would say that it's very important for the Canadian one too. You can't understand Canadian immigration, especially in the last 40, 50 years, without Quebec. And so, you know, to the extent that you want people in Canada to be reading your work and engaging with it, and you want scholars in Canada to be reviewing your work, I think you need to take Quebec much more seriously. Because Quebec was the first province in Canada to do one of the provincial nominee programs in the 70s, because it wanted to control migration to make sure that it had French speakers coming to the province. So that started a whole new dynamic in the contemporary period when you think of Canadian policy maybe getting a little bit more fragmented. And then when you think about immigration as a nation-building project, so when you talk about immigration for the Canadian and Australian cases, you talk about it both as a political economy project, but also as a nation-building project, and I completely agree with that. But the nation-building project of the 80s and 90s in Canada was completely and utterly informed by the fact that Quebec wanted to separate. So you have the referendum of 1980, you have the referendum of 1995, and in the chapter we saw about the 90s, you document some changes in multiculturalism, a little bit less money in it and everything, but Elke Winters, and I think I would say probably I too, have argued that actually in the 1990s was the heyday of multiculturalism, because federal Anglos and Federalists and the rest of Canada were so worried about Quebec separating that, as Winters puts it, there's us, them, and the others. And so the us are the Anglo-Canadians or the Federalists, the others are the Quebecois separatists, and so what are we going to do? We're going to include them, the immigrants of other origins, into the Canadian nation, because it makes us look more diverse, it makes us, be very tolerant, and it's against those, ethnic traditional Quebecois who only want francophone de souche to be part of their nation. And so I think the Canadian story is both a story of the economic selection in the labor market, but it's also a story of nation building, and that wasn't just in the early 20th century. It is totally a project of the contemporary day as well. But I look forward to the book.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much. That was excellent. Everybody in the middle of turning a dissertation into a book should have such great readers.
Yeah, absolutely.
But James, I'll give you an opportunity to respond, and then we have a little bit of time for comments or questions from the floor.
Okay. I guess I'm not going to be able to go through all of the points that you raised, and very excellent points to consider. Rogers, I will start with just commenting briefly on kind of the issue of race and how that plays into dynamics concerning political decentralization or centralization. And honestly, I think it's a great issue to consider. And I'll kind of offer my initial reaction there. So, in terms of the U.S., absolutely right in terms of the issue of slavery promoting sort of a more decentralized political system. And in Canada, it's a little distinct in terms of the push for independence originally. Has a bit more to do with trade disputes with the U.S. and it's a bit more economic in nature. But in Australia, I think issues concerning race largely play an important role in the centralization of political power. And so just in terms of Australian histories, Australia's colonial history, so the 1850s, gold's discovered in Victoria. This brings in a large number of free independent migrants, but also contract workers from Asia. So similar to California at the same point in time. In Australia, as this develops over time, each of the colonial state governments, so originally Victoria, then New South Wales, implement restrictive race-based migration policies. And however, the sort of incongruence between the laws, so while New South Wales and Victoria impose racially based restrictions, Queensland does not. And you begin to see significant numbers of contract workers, both from Asia, but increasingly from Polynesia entering the colony as well. And so it's this incongruence that many of the key figures in promoting federation or independence highlight. And one of the key reasons that it's argued that we need to have uniformity within our legal structures and policies is because of the issue of migration. So really, I'd argue sort of the goal of promoting a white Australia is perceived as resting fundamentally on kind of unifying state structure and bringing some degree of uniformity in terms of laws and policies. But certainly I think that's something to think through more. So I certainly thank you for those comments. Let's see. And in terms of, let me see.
I just want to gather other feedback.
Yeah, it does look like we only have about 10 minutes left. So certainly I think, Irene, we can maybe talk a bit more about...
But, I mean, it would be probably really very beneficial for you to hear other people's reactions.
Okay, so I guess at this point we can...
We need to be more permeable here.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Two quick questions. The first is when you were talking about Australia, you talked about migration as being, or migration policy as being determined by these three factors of workers, settlers, and consumers. And I follow you on the first 2 points, and I was hoping you could elaborate a bit on the third point, is migrants as consumers and how the Australian state tried to foster a migrant consumer. I was curious to hear more about that. And the second question is, echoes some points that Rogers and Irene both raised, and it has to do with, while I agree that much of the migratory flows are driven by economic logics, migrants as workers, I was curious if your story also resonates with other forms of inflows into these countries, other types of inflows and exclusions, especially when we think about the nation-building aspects. So the family reunification, or the asylum seekers, or the political refugees, or other forms of control and regulation that seek to determine who gets in and who gets out.
Okay. Sure. So I guess first, in terms of the point that I was raising about the significance of migration or migrants as consumers, and this largely, I mean, we could see it in the opening decades of independence going up to World War II, but I think it's particularly apparent in the post-war period. So following World War II, both countries implement fairly expansive policies, and this is especially the case in Australia. In fact, from 1947 until 1970, Australia actually receives more European migrants than the United States does, which is significant in the sense that I believe at this time Australia's population, or the U.S.'s population, is about 18 times that of Australia. So I think that gives a real clear indication of the commitment to expansive migration on the part of Australia, and in the U.S., at least in terms of legal migration, it dipping to historically low levels. But the point that I was making about the importance of migrants as consumers, I mean, central to Keynesian models of economic growth is trying to stimulate aggregate demand. And so, largely when talking about pump priming, we're thinking about that in terms of deficit spending on the part of governments. But I think for both Australia as well as Canada, if you look at some of the internal conversations that are going on within the immigration department, as well as policy reports that are generated, expansive migration is also viewed as a form of pump priming for stimulating aggregate demand. And in terms of kind of contrasting Australia with the U.S. and European countries, where migrants are largely brought in as guest workers. They're intended to be workers and not participants in collective life or settlers within the country. In Canada, Australia, migrants are brought in both to fill roles within the labor market, but also are perceived as making unique contributions to aggregate demand and domestic consumption, in the sense that migrants tend to be younger than native-born individuals, and are also, when they arrive, are more prone to inject money into the economy in terms of purchasing a house, purchasing a car, and so on and so forth. And so that's really the idea, that migration is both supposed to target kind of the production side of the equation as well as the consumption or demand. And in those respects, migration ultimately can be viewed as central to kind of policies of macroeconomic stabilization. That much like Keynesianism, it's intended to bring production and consumption into sort of a stable sense of equilibrium, which is not an issue that's really discussed at all within the United States. And so the second question you raised had to do with migrants entering not on the grounds of economic motivations, but because of broader concerns about persecution and so on. And are you asking specifically about the motivations of migrants themselves, or how the governments have addressed those
Do you see a
issues?
similar dynamic in the way that policy is shaped vis-a-vis economic migrants versus these other types of migrants, which we can kind of distinguish analytically, refugees, asylum seekers, family reunification, or is it a kind of similar story that's happening? Or maybe you're not as interested in those groups.
So you mean Australia and Canada versus the U.S. in terms of how they
Sure.
approach those differently? Sure. So, I mean, asylum seekers not something that I've studied quite as much. And I'll mention in Canada, it has been a contentious issue over the past few decades, but not nearly to the extent that it has in Australia. In fact, if you look at new media coverage of the immigration issue in Australia, you're going to find that it's almost entirely dominated by stories about asylum seekers or boat people that are arriving on the country's shores. And actually, it winds up being a fairly low level of individuals. It's sort of the height of, or the highest levels we'd see would be about 6,000 or so asylum seekers that are arriving without authorization in the country. But this generates on the part of Australia a similar response to that in the U.S. in terms of militarizing the Australian coast. Australia's just recently invested several $billions in creating drones that will also, essentially monitor or surveil its northern coast. So I think in Australia you do see this very kind of aggressive approach to asylum seekers. Now, in terms of migrants entering on the basis of family reunification, when policies get reformed in both Canada and Australia, so when we see the end of race-based systems of exclusion, and in Canada this initially emerges in 1962, in Australia it emerges a bit later in 1973. But when that happens, originally, there is, at least initially, a certain degree of parity between the various intake categories. So those admitted on the basis of economic grounds, it's about 40% for family members, 40% for those admitted as workers, and then, depending on the year in question and the demand for refugee status, that can vary some in terms of humanitarian migrants. But over time, family members increasingly come to be viewed, and I don't want to overstate this too much, but those who are admitted without being selected through the point systems are viewed essentially as kind of self-selected, and that the government's not exercising adequate control over those intakes. So, I think largely when we see the point systems being expanded, and this really begins in the early 1990s, or the mid-1990s, for both countries, this is largely a response to kind of declining public support for their immigration programs, and trying to give it a stronger economic focus is intended to essentially bring the public on board with this kind of re-envisioned approach to immigration control. And if you do look at public opinion surveys, you see that public support for expansive migration dips fairly considerably during the 1980s, going into the early 1990s, especially in Australia. And this largely reverses after the countries shift course. And so, I don't want to say that the way the countries approach migration receives, significant public support, but you can see kind of a clear shift, after those reforms are implemented. Mm-hmm.
While Irene's here, I was wondering, have you considered how political incorporation of immigrants fits into your model? Because it strikes me that, as I recall Irene's book, that she says that in Canada it's more permeable in terms of immigrants entering the political system, while in the U.S. it's more insular in terms of them having trouble getting in. So I don't know if that's something you considered.
In terms of naturalization specifically, not as much. And I can't speak to the particulars of the Australian case, but I know that naturalization rates there tend to be much higher, like Canada, when compared to the U.S. And I think it has a lot to do, as Irene notes in her own work, that this has a lot to do with commitments to multiculturalism and actually actively investing government resources in trying to basically try and facilitate migrants' incorporation into both the political system and society more generally. I mean, in the U.S., historically, there's no real existence of what we'd think of as an immigrant policy. There's no resources that are devoted to trying to promote naturalization and so on. And when we do see what we might think of as an immigration or immigrant policy implemented, it tends to occur in the exact opposite direction, trying to exclude migrants from access to things like social services, the welfare state, and so on.
But isn't the market multiculturalism, I'll let you address it, but I just wondered if the market multiculturalism that you described as changing policies in Canada and Australia are moving away from the welcoming policies that Irene described in her book and more toward America. But Irene, you know more about it than I do.
I think the short answer is slightly yes. It's in flux right now. The Harper government's really doing a lot of things, so it's not clear how much is going to stick. But I think this point is really important also because the other part of your argument is about unitary, fragmented, porous, insulated, but you also have a Paul Pearson feedback effects, path dependency argument. And again, I would urge you very strongly to theorize what you mean by path dependency. Because you can mean path dependency, the institutions are set up, and once they're set up, it's very costly to get rid of them, and so they just keep going. It can be path dependency because the cultural tropes change, and so there's certain things that seem normal. So it's more of a Brubaker culturalist argument, but I think it can be very important, especially I think what Rogers was saying in terms of this history of we overcame slavery, we overcame racism, now we have to be very careful in the United States, and I think that would be important in Canada. But in the Canadian case with the voting, one of the reasons it's unitary, and you were very careful to say Australia went anti-immigration in the 90s with Pauline Hanson, etc. Canada didn't. And the weirdest thing about Canada is that public opinion in favor of immigration has just basically had a slow upward ever since the 1980s. There's a little bit of dips and joggles, but it's up. And Canada stands out in all these different countries as being the most pro-immigrant. Now, part of it might be the economic selection, but part of it's because all of these previous immigrants are now citizens and are voting. And so to the extent that there's unitary policy, part of it has been because the right, who would be anti-immigrant, can't get elected in Canada if they're too anti-immigrant. And you can see that in the current Conservative government because it used to be the Reform Party, and the Reform Party in the 80s clearly said they were going to try to stop the ethnic and racial character change of Canadian immigration. They were very explicit. They wanted whites. They didn't quite say it that way, but they were very explicit. They were worried about the non-whites. And they said they were going to get rid of multiculturalism and they were going to bring down the numbers, right? That's what they said. You look at the current Harper government, they embrace Asian immigrants. Ministers go to India and to China and Hong Kong all the time. They keep multiculturalism, and they now seek out and court the visible minority voters. So there's been this huge change, but I don't think they would have had that change if these people couldn't vote, right? And I think one of the things that you're seeing in the United States, potentially maybe Canada's a leading indicator for what might happen in the U.S., because you see that with the struggle with the Republican Party. As the Latino vote raises and as Asian Americans might be sort of moving more strongly into a Democratic partisanship, it's going to get harder and harder to be anti-immigrant in the same way that you get in the European context. So in terms of path dependence and feedback loops, think carefully, I think, about immigrant voting, because it's not interest group politics, but it obviously makes a difference on who gets elected, and so once they're elected, what they do in office in the parliamentary system.
I think sadly we're out of time, but I encourage you to have more conversations with James, and I want to thank all three of our panelists for what was a really lively presentation, and especially I can say, speaking for all of us, I'm very much looking forward to the book that James has had a nice big block of undivided time this year, minus some job talks, to work on, and so thank you all.